And the Romy has already taken the place to chair this session, so I don't have to invite him. I'll begin by introducing Ram Rahman, who needs no introduction, but still, if you're going to do it, then I'll. Yes. So, Ram Rahman is a noted contemporary Indian photographer and curator based in Delhi. He is one of the founding members of the Safdar Hashmi Memorial Trust, Sahmat. Ram Rahman completed his degree in physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He also received a degree in graphic design from the Yale University School of Art in 1979. He divides his time between Delhi and the rest of the world, particularly in New York, where he has lived and worked for many years. When not morphing and mailing images of his friends and other unsuspecting humans, he spends his time photographing and archiving. He is one of our most well-known architectural photographers, and the books that he has authored include Sunil Jana, Photographs 1940-1960, The Sahmat Collective, Art and Activism in India since 1989, co-edited with Jessica Moss, published by Chicago, The Smart Museum of Art. Defending Hussain in the Public Sphere, The Sahmat Experience. Essay in Barefoot Across the Nation, M.F. Hussain and the Idea of India, edited by Sumati Ramaswamy, published by Routledge. Ram has been associated with Sahmat from the time of Sahmat's inception 26 years ago. Today, Ram is going to speak to us about the Nehruvian modern moment, a view of Delhi's architecture and design, 1947-1985. Ram.
Thank you, Ram. I was actually, there was some confusion as to who was to introduce Ram, but Ram, I feel, is in the family, so it's very awkward to introduce him. I had to get all these descriptions for him. I'm very happy that Sohail has done it for us. But I just will now formally ask Ram to deliver his lecture to us.
I think we get the lights off. Thank you all for coming to this lecture in the series on Nehru and the Indian modern, which Sahmat has been holding for the last 8 or 9 months in collaboration with the India International Center. And we would like to thank the India International Center for hosting this series, which has kind of become an extended series. And one of the reasons for doing it was, of course, the 125th birth anniversary of Jawaharlal Nehru. But given the circumstances that we are living in now, in how histories are being rewritten, including modern histories, we felt it was very important to look back at somebody like Nehru in a broad sense. Many of the, I feel a little awkward being in this series because we've had people like Professor Irfan Habib, Professor Yashpal, Professor Akil Bilgrami, and of course Romy, Khosla, amongst many others. I'm not a scholar or a professor or a teacher. I'm basically a photographer with a little bit of interest in modern histories. This talk actually was constructed and delivered last June at the Museum of Modern Art, and it was a closed session for the curators, and that was primarily on the history of Delhi's modern architecture seen through its photography. But I've expanded it a little bit for the audience today to get a little more specific, since many of you know many of the details in the sense that people in the US don't. I'm not going to apologize for the fact that some of it is actually going to be fairly personal as a narrative, because it does link into the larger theme. And I'll begin with my father, whose centenary this year it is. I had forgotten that. He was born in 1915. He was one of the first Indian students of architecture in the United States in the mid-1940s. He went on a West Bengal government scholarship to MIT and graduated in 1944. There were just a handful of Indians studying in the US then, and that connection actually becomes quite important in the narrative of what happens in Delhi. His very big influence was Walter Gropius, who was actually teaching in Harvard. Gropius, of course, exiled from Weimar, Germany, the great Bauhaus teacher, and became a big influence in the Boston area, both at MIT and in Harvard. After he graduated, Gropius got him work in New York with Konrad Wachsmann, Marcel Breuer, who were both Bauhaus products, which was another huge influence on my father. And then he comes back. This was just a little aside for New York, because this is him performing in my grandmother's troupe at Little Carnegie in New York. He was very good looking, as you see. He had a good body. He could play the flute, but had absolutely no rhythm. He ran away with my mother, who was 15, from high school, and they had actually met in Vijay Lakshmi Pandit's dinner in New York. So my father had actually got to know Mrs. Pandit quite well in New York through her daughters, who were at Wellesley when he was at MIT. He came back to work for the West Bengal PWD in 1945-46. B.C. Roy was the, I guess, chief minister, governor, whatever you called it in those days of Bengal. Chief minister. And he, for a very young architect, he gave my father this project, which was his very first project, which was a memorial to Gandhi at Barakpur on the ghats of the Hooghly. This was the very first memorial to Gandhi built after Gandhiji's assassination and was completed in 1949. It's called Gandhi Ghat. Now, this was quite unusual because my father had a very strict Bauhaus training for very functional, straightforward buildings, had studied engineering. He knew concrete work very well, which had not been that widely used, especially in Bengal. And he made this design combining temple shikhar, an Islamic dome, and a cross form, which was the big concrete vault on the stairs, with little detailed references to Frank Lloyd Wright, Eero Saarinen, etc. So already there's a bit of the modern and a bit of the reference to tradition, but being done in a completely modernist language. This image, which became the iconic image for the lecture series, was made by my father at the opening of Gandhi Ghat. And the reason I'm beginning with my father is because, there's this whole debate of what exactly was Nehruvian modernism. This term is bandied about. In my father's case, there was actually a very direct relationship between his practice and the figure of Nehru, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit. Nehru came here. He had never met my father. He saw the monument at the opening and he reacted immediately. He loved it, and he asked from the podium, he said, "Who is the architect?" And my father never forgot that, because he said there were very few people who used that word, architect, at that time. Because of the British engineering systems across India, the railways, military engineering services, etc., people who built buildings were commonly called engineers, and in fact, many of them were engineers. So the fact that somebody would use the word architect surprised my father. He met Nehru there. Nehru asked him his background, and immediately said that we need people like you in Delhi, in the capital, and that you must shift to Delhi right away. It took a few years for that to happen. In the meantime, my father was a very keen photographer, and you'll see some of his photographs, many of which I'm showing today for the first time here. This is he loved photographing himself and us and his wife. This is on a self-timer in his office in Calcutta. You see him here with the models of Gandhi Ghat in the back, the new Secretariat building, which I'll show you shortly, and also the Komagata Maru Memorial, which was built in Baj. Now already he's building these memorials, one to Gandhiji, one to the Komagata Maru. So his practice already got linked to memorials of the national movement, figures of the national movement. So that, nationalism kind of got embedded in him very early on. This is with the model on the steel beam at the construction of the new Secretariat in Calcutta. Oops, sorry. And that was the new Secretariat building. And you see it next to the old colonial architecture. So this was B.C. Roy. This was not Nehru who promoted this. And I did want to emphasize that there's a whole slew of people who were involved in creating that culture of the moment. When he finally comes to Delhi in 1953, this is pretty much almost what Delhi looked like then. This is old Delhi, and you see at the bottom of the picture the wall where Delight Cinema, etc. are now, before it was destroyed, before it was taken down. Much of the land around Delhi was quite barren, rocky, dry. This is, of course, an aerial shot around 1937, 38. The big imperial project of Herbert Baker and Edwin Lutyens. Here also you get an idea of exactly how barren Delhi was. And this is actually very important, because what happens with the creation of the new city, which expands what the British city had done to the south of Shahjahanabad, is very different from the example of Calcutta, Bombay, even Madras, cities which the British had built in the past century. They were already big urban agglomerations. Delhi, on the contrary, became, in a sense, the building of an entirely new capital after the British. And there was all this open land on which to construct. Actually, down here, where is the little pointer? There's something interesting in this photograph. Yeah. Next to where the Getty Images word is, this is taken off their website for free without paying. Down there is a very large tomb, which may be Lodi or pre-Lodi period. Many of these were actually, this is roughly where the Rail Bhavan is now. And there are a couple images of this tomb, and it's a really large tomb. It's like one of the tombs right behind us here. The British actually did destroy many ruins in the building of New Delhi. This is just to give you an idea. This is Imperial Delhi. This was shot 3 days ago in Rashtrapati Bhavan. This is Edwin Lutyens' grand staircase inside the Rashtrapati Bhavan. And within 30 years, we come to J.K. Chowdhury's staircase at IIT. And that's what this journey is going to be about. How we jump from that imperial imagination to this modernism. My mother, who was a dancer, as most of you know, this is a rare shot discovered in Homai Vairawala's collection. There are many shots with Nehru, but this is a particularly nice one. In Rashtrapati Bhavan. This is actually in the Ashoka Hall. That's my mother on the left. That's Roshan Vajifdar, Mulkraj Anand's sister-in-law, next to her. Next to Jawaharlal is Yamini Krishnamurthy. And between Yamini and Roshan, in the back there, is Yamini's younger sister, Jyotishmati, who was a great, great singer and kind of vanished. Both my parents were very much part of that Nehruvian culture. They had moved from Calcutta to Delhi, as did many of the figures that I'm going to talk about today. The only school of architecture in Delhi at that time was the Delhi Polytechnic, which started in the early 1940s. From that, it merged with the School of Planning and became the School of Planning and Architecture really in the 1960s. Bombay, of course, had the JJ School, had been training architects before. And some of that culture of Bombay's training you see in Delhi through the architects who worked for the PWD then, Joglikar, etc. The National Museum, some of the other buildings like Shastri Bhavan, Rail Bhavan, the Supreme Court building, which were being built then. But coming to Delhi, one of the very first things that my father got involved with, which is in the beginning of 1954, was the International Exhibition on Low-Cost Housing. This happened on the grounds where Pragati Maidan is now. And this is quite a remarkable booklet. Again, I'm going to read a couple texts that were written by Jawaharlal Nehru, who in our family as a kid we knew as Panditji. And my parents had become very close to him, both my father as an architect and my mother as a dancer. And he really generated this culture of interaction with artists, architects, in his home, in official meetings, including people bringing people from outside India. A text from the end of that essay in the housing catalogue. I have mentioned many matters which might appear to be beyond the scope of an exhibition on low-cost housing, but I do not think they are outside their scope. A house is not merely a place to take shelter from the rain or the cold or the sun. It is, or should be, an enlargement of one's personality, and if human welfare is our objective, this is bound up with the house. Indeed, changes in housing in other parts of the world have effected social revolutions in the community. So here is a man who has a quite distinct idea of the role of architecture and building in social change and social revolution. And that is something that he really engendered, supported, and helped generate a community of bureaucrats. It was not just Nehru alone, but by giving this kind of guidance, he really opened the field to other people in other states. The governor of Punjab, already Chandigarh was being built in the late 40s and the early 1950s. Nehru did not bring Corbu here. Corbu was brought by, the people who were already involved in Chandigarh, after the air crash when one of the planners had been killed. But he got very excited by Corbu as a figure. This was the little house that my father did in that housing exhibition. Huge booklet with a number of, this is 1954, so right in the beginning, this is the kind of vision that's coming up for the new India. Something very basic, something very simple, something very pragmatic. And for someone like my father who had this Bauhaus training, this was perfect because this is exactly what that training had been about. This is an aerial view of that exhibition. This is Pragati Maidan. And this is the entrance gate which was designed by my father for that. In the back you can see the Purana Killa. And the gate was decorated by many of the artists who were either living in Delhi at that time or who had also begun to gather from all over India. So there was work here done by Elizabeth Brunner, who was the Hungarian, who lived in Delhi for many years and whose mother had taught at Shantiniketan, by Premoja Chowdhury, whose name has been forgotten by many people, and a number of other artists. And this actually was also part of Nehru's vision. He had decreed that in any government building, a certain percentage of the budget would be used to produce art, murals, sculpture on the buildings. And in the 1950s and the 60s, that incentive actually helped the careers of many artists, most famous amongst them Hussain and Satish Gujral, with the murals that they did in Delhi. It really gave them a ground footing economically to then go ahead with their art practice. This was the government housing my father was doing in R.K. Puram. This ideal of working for the government never left him. Many of the architects who had initially started working for the government left and started private practices, but my father never did. He continued right till the end with that ideal. His only regret was that the shift from Bengal to Delhi, he lost, I think, 6 years of his pension benefits, etc., which couldn't be transferred from Bengal. And he regretted it the rest of his life because his pension was quite low at the end. The University Grants Commission building, 1954. These are the institutions of the new India which are being set up. University Grants Commission was set up by Maulana Azad. Azad's impact on building institutions of education and culture like the 3 academies, which followed a little later, was extremely important. Here is a fairly straightforward Bauhaus-style building with a little bit of decorative elements that you can see on it. This is at ITO. Here is another thing that happened with Delhi when that wall was torn down and the sort of economic zone was built with the Delhi Stock Exchange, Delight Cinema, etc., along the southern edge of Shahjahanabad. The other axis, which came down from Firozshah Kotla, Nehru designated it as Fleet Street to put all the newspaper offices down there, the Indian Express, Times of India, Patriot, etc. And then the tax offices, the University Grants Commission offices all came up in that zone. So in a way, it was one of the biggest building projects that had happened after the Mughals and after the British. But the aims of this was very different. This was, building the institutions for the new democratic country. This is 1954. That's my father there with the model of the GPO, the post office, on what became Patel Chowk, with Rajendra Prasad, who was president then. 1955, Nehru gave the Padma Shri to my father, who's 40 years old. And you can imagine what a thrill that was at that time for someone who's 40 and has just, embarked on a career. It was the same year that Nehru was given the Bharat Ratna. Maulana Azad died in 1958, and my father had quite a lot of interaction with him when the three academies were being conceived, Lalit Kala, Sangeet Natak, and Sahitya. This was the tomb. Nehru asked my father again, because of Gandhi Ghat, he asked him to do the tomb for Azad, and he loved this tomb. What my father did, it was an amazing site between the Jama Masjid and the Red Fort. The land was still quite clear and open. My father took the arch from the front of the Jama Masjid, the exact proportion of the arch, and created this cross-barrel vault, thin-shelled concrete structure, which was fairly abstract to fit in with the constructions on either side. But he used a traditional Mughal jali at the base as a definition, as a sort of tribute to that classical tradition. This again was something that Nehru really loved. 1959, there was a major seminar on architecture held by the Lalit Kala Academy at Jaipur House. And here there was a very, very long address given by Jawaharlal. This is a time when all the architects from around India, many of whom are very young, many of whom have returned from England, from the US at that time. Achyut Kanvinde followed my father at MIT, at Harvard, but also worked with Gropius. Kanvinde graduated 1947. Charles Correa graduated 1955, MIT, Bombay-based. But all these architects, Pilu Modi, gather for this seminar on architecture in 1959, and Nehru kind of gives the guiding principles or his philosophy of what the new Indian architecture should be at this seminar. I'm going to read, see if I can get this light on, yeah. This is from Nehru's text at that seminar. I think Milton once said that show me the language of a people, and if I do not know anything about that people, I will tell you what they are, whether they are brave or timid or adventurous, creative or not. The language, of course, is the most subtle medium of a people's thinking. So also architecture and all the creative arts. They are really not something outside yourself. They represent something that is inside us. Either we have that in us or we have not. If we have not, well, you produce a copy of what other people have done. Architecture is influenced by a number of considerations, but apart from those considerations, architecture, like all creative arts, is influenced, if I may use the word, it is often used and misused, by the life forces of a people. If they have that vitality in them, it comes out in painting, in architecture, in poetry, in literature, in everything they do, in life itself. If they have not got it, then they are just pale copies of human beings, without the vitality of human beings, and naturally their arts are pale copies too, and that is basic. You cannot produce by any school course or college course the life force of a people. That it is there, or it is not there, or it may gradually grow. And quite apart from that basic consideration, architecture certainly depends on climate, it depends on functions, the functions of the people living in those buildings or looking after them have to perform. It depends on the state of technological growth, that is to say, in the material we use, and obviously on the state of scientific and technological growth, and so on. So that's a very, very clear statement. There's another remarkable piece at the beginning of his essay when Humayun Kabir, who was, I think, Minister at that time of Culture, had talked about early temple architecture, and Nehru makes a very clear statement about how he finds the temple architecture extremely oppressive. Sorry I didn't bring the quote, but it's just a few sentences, and he actually says that I find the temple corridors in the south extremely depressing and dark. I do not like the dark. I like light and I like air. And that's quite a strong statement to make. By the way, people sitting in the back, there's space in the front. If you're sitting on the floor, please come in the front. You can see better, and there's a lot of space in the front. As Azad died, the three academies had been already conceived, and the building again was given to my father by Nehru. The piece of land, if I'm not mistaken, and I think some researcher can dig up the records, was got from the Waqf board. Because on that piece of land, on that what became the Mandi House Circle, there were actually ruins, like in much of New Delhi. And there was a ruin of a small mosque and some graves on that site. What you're seeing here is the very first model that my father did for Rabindra Bhavan. And you see it looks almost like the UGC building, looks like an office building. This is another view. When Nehru saw this, he blew his top. He yelled at my father. He was very famous for his temper, and said that, "What is this?" He said, this looks like an office building. You're building a cultural center in the memory of Rabindranath Tagore, and this building has nothing to do with the philosophy of Tagore. And my father came back like shaking. I was very, very little, but I remember that because these intense discussions took place in the house. And he told Nehru, he said, and Nehru said that you've done the Gandhi Ghat, you've done the Maulana Azad, and they're so beautiful. Why can't you do this? And my father said, well, those are memorials, those are single structures, and I haven't done an institutional building which has that kind of a language, a formal language or spirit. And Nehru said, well, do it, because I know that you can do it. And they actually sat as the design developed. So in many ways, what ended up as the academies and Rabindra Bhavan was a direct collaboration between Nehru and my father. And that's where the personal really comes in, because it was a very important stage in my father's development. This is him going over the final plans of the Rabindra Bhavan as it finally took shape. And what my father did is he separated the buildings, the academy buildings on one side, the gallery on one side, and left the ruins of the mosque and the graves in the middle. There was this mound, a natural mound, which has slowly been wiped out, and the last few years actually dug up, and a big structure has been built over there. This is 1961. Another piece of text from that same seminar, which I think would be of relevance here, was in reference to Chandigarh. And as I said, Nehru was not the man who brought Corbu to Chandigarh, but when Corbu came, he just loved the man, he loved the idea, he loved his intellectual vision and engagement. And this is what he says. Now I have welcomed very greatly one great experiment in India, which you know very well, Chandigarh. Many people argue about it. Some like it, some dislike it. It is totally immaterial whether you like it or not. It is the biggest job of its kind in India. It was a whole new city which was being built. That is why I welcome it. It is the biggest because it hits you on the head, because it makes you think. You may squirm at the impact, but it makes you think and imbibe new ideas. And the one thing that India requires in so many fields is to be hit on the head so that you may think. I do not like every building in Chandigarh. I like a few very much. I like the general conception of the township very much. But what I like above all is this creative approach, not being tied down to what has been done by our forefathers and the like, but thinking out in new terms, trying to think in terms of light and air, comes back here, and ground and water and human beings, not in terms of rules and regulations laid down by our ancestors. Therefore, Chandigarh is of enormous importance regardless of whether something in it succeeds or something in it does not succeed. As a matter of fact, even now, many things in Chandigarh have spread, many ideas in small and big ways. Chandigarh, as you well know, is more famous in the world than most Indian towns or cities, excepting the well-known 3 or 4, simply because it is a new thing coming out. It is a thing of power coming out of a powerful mind. And if you want anything of power, it must come out of a powerful mind, not a flat mind or a mind which is a mirror, and that too, not a very clear mirror reflecting someone else's mind. There is no doubt that Le Corbusier is a man with a powerful creative type of mind. Because he has that, he may become extravagant occasionally. He can produce extravaganza occasionally, but it is better to have that than to have a swelled head with no mind at all. Mr. Winston Churchill was once accused of having a swelled head. His answer was, it is better to have a swelled head than no head at all. The main thing today is that a tremendous deal of building is taking place in India, and an attempt should be made to give it a right direction and to encourage creative minds to function with a measure of freedom so that new types may come out, new designs, new ideas, and out of that amalgam, something new and good will emerge. This is again 1959. So that's the background of Rabindra Bhavan. The earlier model got adapted a little bit and in a way became the WHO headquarters on Ring Road many years later. This is what emerged at Mandi House in 1961. Completely different from a formal language that my father had ever used before, using jalis, using brick, using the quartzite stone of Delhi with sloping walls in reference to the Tughlaq buildings, which were scattered all over Delhi. As I said, still barren at that time. You could see many of those monuments across the mustard fields. Very simple, straight lines. He used fire bricks. Very different from what Corbusier was doing with exposed concrete in Chandigarh. Architects like my father, like Joseph Stein, who designed the complex next to this is of course the new building, were not using exposed concrete. They were using materials, local materials, stone facades. Stein really pioneered the use of grit finishes, which he felt would last longer and last better. So here were architects who were really looking at local materials and how to use them. This is the internal stair. This, of course, a lot of this has been defaced and deformed, but that's another story. I think it's still one of the nicest gallery spaces in Delhi. But this kind of openness, airiness, here you have the light and you have the air. On the left is the upper gallery, what it used to look like with its northern skylights and skylights along the wall. And on the right is what it has become now. The floors were torn out, the terrazzo floors. Basically, they were perfectly fine floors. And this cheap wooden veneer was put. False ceilings were, and the whole staircase was sealed. This, unfortunately, was really to generate retirement incomes. And it's the change of what happened from the 60s to the kind of corruption that we live in now, which is actually manifest in building. And I think you can see that, quite obviously. And this is where that idea of the social in architecture that Nehru had an idealism about has turned into something completely different. This was from the Hindustan Times at the same time. I did manage to stop them putting glass facades on the jalis, on the Rabindra Bhavan, which is on the right. And they were going to build a lift shaft on top of where the graves were, like a huge brick lift shaft going up to the upper part of the gallery. That didn't happen, but after his Rabindra Bhavan experience, his design completely changed, became more expressive, still using completely modern material, but this is the Patel Bhavan, this is the government buildings being done, of which he did many across Delhi and in also many other parts of India. The designs were generated here and sent across the country. You see the articulation of the pillars, quite simple using concrete, but at least there's a style and a visionary use of material for fairly simple structures. This is the Curzon Road housing, Untitled flats, staircases. You'll see a lot of staircases where the architects really go a bit wild. And that was the state of the staircase a few years ago, which was here just a question of maintenance, not any other willful destruction, but just... And Nehru had talked in that text about how we maintain our buildings again. This was also a staircase in the clubhouse of the Curzon Road hostels. And remember, this is a fairly simple government building, but look at the structure and the use of steel and cantilever in this stair. This is what they used to look like, the Curzon Road hostels. This is the stair from the other side. And the center is what the stair has become now. The color shot. This is actually one of my favorite pictures of my father's. This is taken from Azad Bhavan, which is the arch that you see and the auditorium on the left, designed by Achyut Kanvinde. And in the back is my father's Indraprastha building, the tax office. Now here are two products of Walter Gropius, two major students of Gropius. And I love this picture because this is a kind of tribute in a way to Gropius. That's the income tax, the Indraprastha Bhavan. And another view. This is before Hussain did his mural on the side of this building. As I told you, those mural projects really gave an economic base to many artists at the time. Now, the architects at that time, particularly for someone like my father who's working in the government, we actually didn't have materials, hinges, light switches, door handles, which were, practical or well made. And my father, since he'd studied engineering, was trying to, come up with ideas of making something simple and cheap. And he came up with these locks, which you see all over India now, which was a multifunction lock, which had a handle. You could put your own lock on it. It could be used on the left or on the right. It was very cheaply made with one piece of flat metal which was pressed, one rod which was bent, and a few little welded parts. This was done for the UNCTAD flats. So this is the kind of invention that many architects or designers at that time had to do because of the resources which we didn't have at the time. And it led to great invention in design. This is Nehru's funeral, 1964. And as I said, my parents, for them, Nehru was like a demigod. And, he would, as I said, bring these people, brought Roberto Rossellini to India to make film. He would get my parents home to have dinner with Pier Paolo Pasolini and Alberto Moravia, who were traveling through India at the same time. So there was a sort of cultural renaissance, which was very linked to the modern. And when I see Nehru actually supporting the modern movement, someone like Corbu, who comes out of the modern movement in Europe, I still find it a bit surprising because, he grew up in Anand Bhavan, living then in Teen Murti, etc., in this very anglicized British colonial culture, which is what he grew up in England also, in his own education and in his own language, his English language. So I find it very remarkable that someone like that supported and propagated this totally modernist vision, which was not English, actually. There were a few English practitioners like Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew, who also worked in Chandigarh, but it is surprising. Nehru's funeral for us was very important. And for me, this symbolizes, in a way, the end of that era, because in the back, this is shot from the top of the School of Planning and Architecture building at ITO. And in the back, you see the construction of the Indraprastha Bhavan happening. And further back, you see the WHO building under construction. So Nehru's body is going past that modern India, which he had envisioned. And that is us at the window of the School of Planning. That's my mother, my cousin Zarina, my sister Sukanya, and my nanny, my ayah, Chand Banu Bibi, who was from Dhaka. They're all in white saris, as you see. I'm in a colored shirt with dark glasses. Switching now, I'm going to jump a little back and forth. I wanted to talk about the broad culture of Delhi at that time. And I'm sticking to Delhi because it's something that I know very well. And you'll see later when I show you Madan Mahata's photographs why the site of Delhi actually is very important in our modernity. Patwant Singh, who came from a contract background, his parents were contractors who had helped build New Delhi. The family had a house on what was Rattenden Road, now known as Amrita Shergill Marg, just across the lawn here, had started a magazine called Indian Builder in Bombay. And it was a magazine for the building trade and the contractors trade, and had ads of, tiles, taps, water tanks, etc. He came to my father in 1955 to ask if he could publish the new secretariat in Calcutta, because that building was the first modern, tall, steel frame structure in India. So it was kind of revolutionary in its structure. And he came to our house in Sujan Singh Park, and my father met him, liked him. He was a very lively Sardar. And my father said to him that, why don't you also start a design magazine? Why just contracting? And Patwant thought that's a great idea. And that generated design. This is the announcement in Indian Design, in Indian Builder, saying that from the 1st of January 1957, we have Design magazine coming out. This was very important in Delhi's culture at that time. I'm going to show you some of the remarkable covers, the graphics of design, done mainly by Dilip Chowdhury, the great, great graphic designer, again somebody whose name has really vanished in history, which is a great, great shame. Dilip Chowdhury was design director. Dilip Chowdhury then went on to do all the covers of Seminar magazine for the Thapars, for Raj and Ramesh Thapar. This was the editorial board. And just look at that. When I showed this at MoMA in June, they almost fell off their chairs. Because, these people were not just names on the editorial board. They were actual contributors. Everyone wrote for the magazine. Initially, it was very thin. It got thicker and thicker and thicker. And it became the venue for publishing all this new design which was happening across India. Architecture, dance, music. Charles Fabry was writing architectural criticism. The longest piece that Charles wrote on architecture in Design magazine was on the India International Center when it was first built. Narayana Menon was writing on music, on dance. Fabry was writing on dance. Ram Kumar on painting. Ram Kumar from Paris. Krishna Reddy from Paris. Long articles on surrealism, bringing ideas in from there. This is Patwant Singh consulting with an important editorial advisor, whose name I will not take, in his home, and that's a Noguchi lamp. You can see Patwant's style in this picture. But he was somebody who was completely self-taught and became this incredible, globe-trotting sort of design and politics aficionado also. But look at these covers. This is a Satish Gujral painting, actually. This is from a mural that he had done in Pierre Jeanneret's Gandhi Bhavan in Chandigarh. This is a detail from that mural. Article on the furniture by Pierre Jeanneret. This is 1958. And this article is by Jeet Malhotra, the architect who worked with Jeanneret and Corbu in Chandigarh for many years. And actually is again somebody whose work really needs to be looked at again. Also did some of the most stunning photographs of Chandigarh, of his own buildings, of Jeanneret's buildings, of Corbu's buildings, many of which were published either in Marg or in Design magazine. Jeanneret really connected with India's culture, and he became very close to my father. He lived here till 1965 in Chandigarh. And in many ways, my own feeling is that he had a bigger influence on Indian architects than Corb. He worked a lot with local materials. He was fascinated by the Newar, the charpais in Punjab. He came up with these very simple structures for chairs, for tables, very inventive, which now sell for huge amounts of money in Christie's. Many of which, these chairs, the originals, by the way, are sitting in Patwant's house across Lodi Gardens in case anyone has a truck and wants to break in at night. This is Design Magazine with the lost mural of Satish Gujral on the facade of the Odeon Cinema in Delhi. Some private entities also gave artists commissions inspired by what they were doing in the government buildings. Satish had done murals for the Railway Bhavan, the Northern Railway Bhavan, and this really gave Satish his footing because he set up these kilns to do ceramics for these murals. And of course, with his background in mural seeing and studying under Siqueiros and the mural painters in Mexico, he was well versed in that mural culture. Article on textiles by Riten Mazumdar, another very important figure in design at the time. Riten had come out of Shantiniketan, was a student of Nandalal Bose, was there at the same time as Subramaniam, Krishna Reddy. Riten went on to Europe, worked with Marimekko, came back to India and did extremely important work with block printing, silk screen printing on fabrics, but reached into our local weaves, our local traditions, our local dyes, but became very inventive with using typography and texts in his textile designs. Much of this was published in Design Magazine. Oops, sorry. Slide I recently found of my photograph of Riten's house, designed by Charles Correa. Tiny little plot towards the Qutub. And you see on the wall back there, silk screen. Riten used coins, the typography of ancient Indian coins, images from Mohenjo-daro, etc. So really looking back into our traditional cultural roots, but making something very inventive through textiles, through carpets, through rugs. Article on Nelly Sechna's textile work, wall hangings. This is just to give you an idea of the kind of culture that was developing at the time, which really cut across fields. Delhi blue pottery was set up at the same time. This is a cover of Design Magazine done by Luc Durand. Luc Durand, who's still alive, lives in Montreal, came back to India after many years, was a young Canadian architect who had become very close to Pierre Jeanneret. Luc designed the upper floor of Patwant Singh's ancestral house. Amazing design, which is these very simple concrete barrel vaults across the roof of the older colonial building below. That chimney hanging fireplace was designed by my father, and around that are all the Pierre Jeanneret originals. In the back is a huge tapestry done by an Australian girlfriend of Patwant's. This is given by Pierre Jeanneret to my father. It hangs on my wall. This is the original model for the hand monument by Corbu in Chandigarh. And it's something that I've grown up with. And that's on the back. So Ratan Singh, the modeler, is well remembered. That's Luc Durand. And that's the lobby of the Sheila Cinema. And this is quite recent. This was about 2 or 3 years ago, shot by me. Now, the Sheila Cinema was designed by my father in 1961. This is exactly the same time as Rabindra Bhavan. But because this is a private building, he couldn't actually practice privately. So this was done sort of quietly for his friend, Mr. Kaushish, who was the owner. And as my mother used to keep complaining about these little private commissions, that my father would get paid in bottles of scotch. But here, because this was an entertainment center, it was the first 70 mm cinema in India. he really went to town and had fun. I mean, he could become really expressive. And he brought in Luc Durand, who, by the way, was also roommate of John Bissell for a while in that early period, 1960, 1959, just when John was setting up Fab India. And that will also come into the narrative. That's Sheila Cinema. This is exactly what it looks like now, by the way. This is one of the best preserved pieces of that time. The design culture of those first 15 years after independence in India was extremely cosmopolitan. It was extremely self-confident. You saw that editorial board of Design magazine with the kinds of figures who had got involved, many of whom were traveling to India, had spent time here, who were making work here. This is Philip Johnson. This is photographs taken by my father. Philip Johnson, the architect, who my father took to Chandigarh in 1965. But these are the kinds of people who are coming in and out of India and, dealing with Indian architects on a completely equal level. There was nothing about us being a, third world country, etc. There was this supreme confidence of the new nation. Of course, we had limited resources, but there was this incredible fervor of imagination. That's also Johnson in Chandigarh by my dad. There's a whole series of pictures. I'm just going to show you a few. And this is 1969. This is Buckminster Fuller and Joe Stein at the zoo, which was also designed by my father, in front of the Purana Killa. This was after Bucky Fuller had delivered his Nehru memorial address, over which I had a big fight with him because I was studying physics at that time, and his whole Dymaxion concept of the structure of the universe, which was based on hexagons, I argued with. I said that that's not quite what I believe or what I've been told. He had a hearing aid in his pocket, so you had to yell into his pocket. Marg magazine, of course, was the other very important cultural resource, but even though the name came from Modern Architectural Research Group, actually didn't do very many issues on contemporary architecture. This was one in 1965, which kind of wrapped up what had happened in modern Indian architecture up till that time. And the cover, of course, is Chandigarh. But the inside I thought I'd show you is a feature on the India International Center. And the great thing about Marg was that, like Design magazine had these amazing covers. The interiors of Design were quite simple. It was letterpress printed at the Statesman Press. This, with Dolly taking control, had an amazingly inventive interior graphics, which was wonderful at the time. Using tracing papers, handmade papers, offset, and look at how they present the IIC here. Just a little aside, since part of the next part is really going to be based more on photography. Sunil Jana, whose work many of you have seen, I've given lectures on it. But this is the other Nehruvian India, the temples of modern India, which are coming up in Bengal, Bihar, Orissa. And I'm going to show you just a few of the pictures that Jana made, because these are kind of iconic images of that modern India being built. These are the steel plants, the jute mills. Inspired by Margaret Burke-White, who had photographed industrial America before she came to India and became close to Jana. And Burke-White had, of course, also photographed the Industrial Revolution in Russia from the 20s onwards, under Stalinist Russia. Madan Mahata, who died last year, I had done a big exhibition of his architectural work. This is all photography based, but here is something remarkable because there was this incredibly talented photographer who had studied, one of the first to have formally studied. He studied in England. The family had studios in Rawalpindi, Srinagar, Delhi. In fact, right now it's the centenary of the Mahata Studios, and there's a wonderful exhibition up at the Indira Gandhi National Center in the Twin Galleries. Please go see it. It's really the first exhibition in India which is a tribute to a single photography studio. And it is all the uncles, the grandfathers, the brothers, all their work, beautifully put up. And many of the pictures that I'm going to show you now are actually up there. Madan happens to be in Delhi at a moment in time when all these architects have gathered here and are producing visionary work, a lot of which was actually for the state, for the government. It was the biggest employer at that time, and gave them a free hand. This was the exhibition. This was in Bombay. This was the kind of building that Stein, Kanvinde, my father, came to when they arrived in Delhi. This was Sapru House. And these were primarily done by the Bombay trained architects, and you can see that kind of culture that that they brought with them into this kind of building. This is in the 1950s. This was Ashoka Hotel. The thing with Madan is he was, of course, a well-trained photographer, but it turned out that he had an amazing eye for architecture. He really understood architecture. He had a Linhof camera with a wide-angle lens, essential for making these incredible images of architecture. So this is a double-edged, double whammy. You have an amazingly talented photographer, and you have architecture, which is equally visionary, being photographed by this man. An incredible document of a scale of modernism which is actually very rare anywhere in the world. And I'm only going to show you a small slice. I don't know if any of the architects are sitting here I can't see in the dark. This was the structure of Kanvinde's Perilal Bhavan in the ITO. See the Patriot building in the back. That's Kanvinde's Gujarat Bhavan in Chanakyapuri. Contrast that to the new Maharashtra Sadan, which has come up on Curzon Road, opposite the Untitled Flats, which my dad had done. I mean, one can go into any of the new government buildings, the new Ministry of External Affairs, which has come up opposite the National Museum, which Lalit Mansingh told me was directed by Jaswant Singh. One of the very remarkable ensembles of buildings in Delhi was J.K. Chowdhury's IIT. The IITs were actually initiated in the 1950s, the ideas by Maulana Azad again. This was the institution building of that period, and this is literally the institution building. J.K. Chowdhury had worked in Chandigarh. He brings that training, that vocabulary, that language of exposed concrete, etc., to Delhi, but he really makes it his own. There's a language, a formal language that he develops, which is very lively and very wonderful, and ideal set for Madan to unleash his eye. You see those Jean Array-inspired chairs? The staircases, as I said, you'll see the architects really go wild. because this is where they can really push their expressive and technological capabilities and really have fun in the building. These are the lecture halls. Quite remarkable. And this is an amazing photograph by Madan, because this is shot, I'm always fascinated by why he shot it from here. It's shot from under the handrail. So he actually, he looked, and he didn't shoot it from above the handrail at human height. He actually went down on his knees, and he found this view to make this image, which to me is quite remarkable, because he really captures a sense of space, of light, of material, and of relationships. And this is very visionary work. This is, these are the institutions where the young are going to be trained in the new sciences. This is the whole thrust of the Indian modern, even in thinking. This is hitting them on the head. This is to make you think. This is Shivnath Prasad, who actually never worked with Corbu, but was possibly the most sort of Corbu-esque architect in Delhi. And this, of course, is the Sriram Center, which is a theater center for the arts. And you see, this is while it was being built, but it's already being used. There's a little board there for a play by Yatrik. Joy Michael. Now, this is the amazing thing about Madan. He was commissioned to make these pictures for Mini Boga. Mini Boga, who was making furniture out of teak, possibly inspired by Jean Arrêt and the culture of the times, but there was this great invention. We didn't have a huge furniture industry. You couldn't sort of walk in and buy sofas and chairs and things. People like Ravi Sikri, who had trained as an architect, Mini Boga, began making furniture, very simple, beautifully made, using rope, using cloth, using canvas. This photograph was supposed to be a sort of publicity picture for Mini Boga's furniture. But hanging on the wall in the back are Riten Mozumdar's wall hangings with his Bengali script experiments. That's John Bissell on the left. That's Shona Ray, another name who is forgotten, very important in the handicrafts movement. And that's Bharti Sharma lounging on the dari, which has probably been made by John in Panipat. Now, John Bissell came to India, worked with the Ford Foundation, ended up, of course, living here and set up this incredible institution called Fab India. My top is Fab India today, but my bottom pajamas are from Madhya Pradesh Emporium. The Fab India ones don't quite fit me. But John's whole ideal was to work with handloom. This was inspired by people like Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, who had set up the handloom, IIC, the cottage industries, Emporium. And this is such an important part of the culture of Delhi of the time, which is quite different from what's happening in, say, Ahmedabad or Bombay or Calcutta. It becomes quite Delhi-specific, along with these buildings. I remember, the Cottage Industries Emporium, a very exciting event was when Sushila Jairam came up with these mannequins which were covered in jute cloth. So this was like a very exciting happening, that these were kind of, handloom mannequins. And my mother, rushed us all to see the new mannequins in Cottage Industries Emporium. This was the kind of culture of that moment. This is Riten Mozumdar in his house, and these are all Madan Mahata's photographs, by the way. So Madan in a way becomes the repository of a cultural document also. This is a house designed by Charles. I showed you my little slide of it before, which was in color. This is Achyut Kanvinde in his own house. And it's amazing that Madan captured some of these architects in their own homes. Again, beautiful photograph, you know. And that's Ram Sharma in his own house. And you begin to see the vocabulary which is happening in these homes. The use of white painted brick, exposed concrete for the ceilings, kota stone for the floor, either Mini Boga or Ravi Sikri furniture. I think here it's Mini Boga again. Riten Mozumdar cushion covers. I mean, you could hop from house to house and almost, you know, exchange the furniture, the textiles at that time. It was a very, you know, Delhi was a small city. Remember, I showed you those barren expanses, and the design culture was also quite small but very intense, and there was an incredible back and forth and to and fro. That's Raj Rival's own house. And now we come to Joseph Allen Stein. Stein had come from California, where he left the country because of rising McCarthyism in the early 1950s. He landed up in France. And Stein was not, you know, overtly political or something, but he did make that leap. And in France, he was contacted by, oh God, I'm losing my memory. From Los Angeles. He was on the editorial board. Richard Neutra. Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's. Richard Neutra had been asked actually by B.C. Roy to help set up the architecture department at the Bengal Engineering College. And Neutra asked Stein in France whether he would like to come and teach there for a while, and Stein came to Calcutta, which is where he met my father. And he moved to Delhi again because of this atmosphere that, you know, that Delhi was generating. This was the great generator of the new jobs, the new ideas, the coming together of the dancers, the musicians, the architects. You know, the new state was the great new patron. So Stein arrives here and starts doing, you know, many different projects, but a long series of projects he did, and very remarkable, which are actually publicly not very well known because these are factory buildings. These were for escorts. But they're amazing buildings, and each one of them he came up with this very cheap roofing structural material, which is extremely inventive. Wonderful buildings, and designed for great air, for great light for the workers down below, in the real ideals of the modern movement. Again, amazing photographs. This is all escorts. And the American school, which sadly most of it has been torn down, this time not by the government or Narendra Modi, but by the Americans. So those tendencies actually go across. These were also very inventive, sort of parabolic dome, very lightweight material. The last manifestation of that is in the trade fair, the big building, which is, you know, closer to where the metro is now. And this is next door to us, the Ford Foundation. That's Joe Stein coming up the stairs, and that's Madan Mahata's shoes. So wonderful photograph, that's there. And that hanging is probably Nelly Seth now, that you see over there. These cushions are all covered in Fab India fabrics. This is also Ford Foundation. And that building, of course, is the IIC, before its additions and its second floor. And this is what the lounge originally looked like. This is Kuldeep Singh. This is the NDMC Center in opposite the Jantar Mantar. Again, one of my favorite pictures by Madan. Kuldeep was one of the architects who used exposed concrete quite extensively in Delhi, but very inventively. That's the building. It's a real takeoff and a tribute to Jantar Mantar, which is right opposite. This is his building near the Ashad village. Very hard to see these buildings like this now because they're all covered by trees. This is the design group, Ranjit Sabiki, Syrian Church. Raj Rewal, the Asian Games Village. We come into a section on housing because housing was very important for many of these architects. This is Kuldeep Singh. It's Malviya Nagar housing, DDA. Extremely inventive use of brick, which of course has all been plastered over now. Yamuna Apartments. This is also Ranjit Sabiki Design Group. Housing became a very important part of the work that all these architects had done in Delhi. Charles Correa, this is the British Council, of course, with the mural by Howard Hodgkin. And this is the building of the LIC building, designed by Charles, shot by Madan. I actually love this picture more than the finished building because it gives an idea of the scale of the ambition of this building in a way, I think, more powerfully than the glass facade ended up. This is the Baha'i temple, which was designed by the Iranian architect Saba. And that's what became of Rabindra Bhavan, the first model. This is my father's WHO building on Ring Road. And that's the Hindustan Times, again done by my father as a secret commission. And this is Raj Rewal. Now, Rewal actually had designed this building to be an exposed concrete structure. Many of the buildings that Rewal built took many years to complete because of how government finances took their time. So by the time this building finally came up, this is the state STC building, State Trading Corporation on Janpat, he decided to clad it with sandstone, which is what he had started doing, which was again a reference to the Mughal buildings of Delhi. And I do remember, by the way, many of these buildings that you're seeing here were engineered by Mahendra Raj, who's equally great as an engineer and one of the great engineers of the world, actually. This is Jaspir Soni, one of the exhibition buildings in the trade fair. This is 1972. And then we come to Raj Rewal's famous pyramid, the Asia 1972 buildings. This was quite a remarkable, this is of course under construction. So this was initially thought of as a space frame, and of course it couldn't be built in steel because we didn't have enough steel. So Mahendra Raj engineered this to be done in literally hand-poured concrete. Now here is this high-tech building which is being built fairly simply, fairly crudely by hand. And this is where that incredible design invention happened because of your limited resources. There was, as I had said earlier, many of these architects really pushed their design imagination because of the limits that they had to face. And remarkable building. And I'm ending with this now because this building and the Nehru Pavilion, which I'm just going to show you, are almost certainly at this point going to be destroyed by this government. That piece of land has been handed over to some Singaporean firm to make an air-conditioned conference center. Now, you know, we're sitting in this city. The government has just withdrawn nomination to UNESCO done by INTAC for World Heritage. Here we are sitting in a city which has some of the greatest medieval monuments in the world, the great Mughal architecture, the great imperial British Delhi, and then what I'm showing you is an incredible modernist. And I'm just showing you a little bit because this is what we were able to show at the Photo Inc. gallery run by Devika Daulat Singh 3 years ago. And luckily I managed to persuade Madan to do this exhibition of his architectural work because he kept asking me, he said that, you know, who would be interested? And I said, Madan, just listen to me. And the time was right because digital technology helped us, you know, resurrect some of these old photographs. Devika Daulat Singh had opened this beautiful gallery and was, you know, enthusiastic about doing this exhibition. So it all happened at a time when it was right, and I'm very happy I was able to do it before Madan passed away. I did have to run and get many of these negatives back from the architects because he started handing them off, saying, well, you know, what am I going to do with all this? But it's a treasure trove. And I don't think we actually realize the site of Delhi, and that's why I wanted to emphasize how barren it was because of that land that this scale of building could happen in this city. When I took this show to Bombay, I remember, you know, people like Charles, etc., agape, because none of this has actually ever been published as a full collection. The one book which was done a number of years ago by Ram Sharma, Moloy Chatterjee, and Raj Rewal was Architecture in India for the Festival of India in France in 1986. But that's, you know, a very important publication because for the first time it had collected a lot of this work together. But the scale of what happened in Delhi is very little known. And this is a, you know, this is a piece of modernism anywhere in the world, which is extremely important. And we are already losing much of this. This is the Nehru Pavilion. And this is going to be the first which is going to be attacked. This was built as the permanent home for the famous exhibition done by Charles and Ray Ames after the death of Nehru in the 1960s, which traveled to many parts of the world. It was a visionary exhibition, partly based on Jawaharlal Nehru's discovery of India, but also on the new India afterwards, the emergence of the new modern nation state. This was a underground pyramid building with exposed concrete, which is still up there, and I suggest all of you go and pay your last visits before it is gone, because other than Aurangzeb, Nehru is the other main target of the powers that be right now. This is the upper part, the outside of the Nehru Pavilion, and there is going to be a big petition, etc. And when the lights come up, I'll ask all of you to raise your hands if you would support this petition. But I think the days of petitions are far gone. Coming back to that funeral shot, which is the end of that Nehruvian era, and then two pictures of ghosts of Nehru. This is a photograph I took a few years ago at a costume party. That's Ashok Nehru on the left. as Jawaharlal with his rose. That's Lalit Nirula in the middle as Karunanidhi. And Bernard Imhasli on the right as Ottavio Quattrocchi. So that really encompasses a broad history. And then last, a Nehru that I found in Gol Market, actually in Gol Market, in the building structure of Gol Market. Thank you. Oh, it went a bit long. Sorry.
Thank you, Ram, for that extraordinary filling in of a historical time which has actually never been assembled together. So I think Ram has done an incredible amount of work on defining the design culture of modern India. It's difficult for us to realize this because today we are now living in growingly living in times when the design culture has gone underground. It's almost been taken over by corporates and private people working behind closed doors. We see a certain relationship between designers and the ideal of India and the people who are ruling India. And that has completely disappeared. So I think that what Ram has showed us is incredibly valuable. We don't have so much time for questions, but certainly if there are any comments or questions, we can have them. Is there a mic? Ah.
And please identify yourself.
So I'm Sanjay Yadav, a writer. When discussing those, the trade fair buildings, you said they didn't have enough steel. You know, but that can't be used as an excuse. I mean, those who built the Qutub Minar, the magnificent tower, they built it from local materials. And most of the Raj buildings too have been built from materials locally or within India. So you can't use that as an excuse that we didn't have this or we didn't have that. I mean, it's a test of your genius is being able to make a beautiful building from what's available.
But I think that's I don't think it was an excuse. I think that's what he did. But the idea was that he wanted to build a visionary structure, and ultimately it could be built through the inventive use of available material. So I don't think it was an excuse, but it was a, you know, I mean, that's my understanding. I think that Raj is here. He can talk about it a little more. But it was, the idea was to make this very visionary structure on a scale which was quite massive, which would have been maybe easier to do in steel. I don't know, Raj, would you like to elaborate? No, they'll bring you a mic.
Well, I think, imagine 1970 when the project was given to me. And this was the 25th years of India's independence. Don't forget that. And I was very much aware of concrete structures as well as space frame before I got into this project. And we had done, I mean, I worked in Paris for Michel Ecouchat. We'd done a steel space frame in Kuwait. So even at that time when the project was being done, I thought maybe it should be a wall which should be a sunbreaker and a roof which can be, of course, in concrete. And but it was so much a steel thinking going on at that time that it was almost considered sort of retro project to think of it doing it in concrete. But I thought this is all what we can do. We in fact had no steel at the time. And when I proposed to Mahinda Raj, and I think we should mention the name Dorai Raj, the engineer from the government side. I mean, he said, oh, I'll make a sample for you in the Hindustan Housing Factory for it. So you can really go ahead. So I think that is the genesis of it. And the span of 256 feet was at that time the largest span of any space frame structure, including Buckminster Fuller project of steel dome. And when he came on the site, he was quite aghast. He was quite actually furious. So there's a photograph of myself, Fuller, and Mahinda Raj, the three of us standing. And he started talking first with Mahinda Raj, why we couldn't do it in steel. And Mahinda Raj looked at me, and he was almost thinking that, all right, steel could be done, but we don't have it. But I said very positively that that is the ideal thing for us to do. And I have never changed my mind. And when the project was photographed by some French students who went to Philadelphia, and La Rochelle was the mastermind of thinking about space frame structure, he was quite amazed. Okay, this has been done. So he invited me to give a talk there in Philadelphia at that time. And Philadelphia was very much a place where Khan had taught, and there were a lot of Fuller students there, and they all kind of started slightly attacking the project. Okay, why have you done something in concrete which is meant to be in steel? So I started explaining a little bit, but Monsieur Racollet stood up and explained much better the project. And he said, look, when we first started doing the space frame, it was done by shelving systems, which were available in steel in USA during the war. And actually, it makes a lot more sense to do it in concrete because you can use steel rods the way you want. And the way we have used steel plates in the tension areas is quite remarkable. And we could have such thin members that could always be only be made by handmade structures. So actually, we had achieved something. And I was very surprised. I was not very surprised when the French curator came for the Pompidou Museum. They said, oh, this is what the French wish could have done at one time. And that's where it is being exhibited. So I have no, let's say, thinking that we translated a steel structure in concrete. In fact, I must say Murad Chaudhry then, a couple of years after, did something in Kashmir, carried on this in concrete. So I think it makes sense to do things our own way. That's it.
Are there any more questions?
Yes, Mr. Ram, the way it is established now, these structures are being demolished very soon. So do you think Mr. Raj Raval or Mahendra Raj, being a architect and the engineer, they have any say to do it, to stop it?
Well, I'm sure they're going to make a noise about it, but I think we are living in a situation where the power of money has become more important than the power of culture or of cultural heritage. But I think we're going to try, and more than them, I think we should make a big public appeal, because I mean, this is, this, as I said, from what I showed, and when I showed this first, I did a shorter version of this in the Museum of Modern Art, and they were quite zapped. And they said, how come we don't know any of this material? And I said, that's because you only looked at the white people. You only looked at Corbu and Louis Kahn. And I'm not going to show you any of that. And Joe Stein, we don't regard as a white person. This is not just India's heritage. It's actually, in modernism, it's an extremely, I have come to realize more and more. And even in terms of photography, I had mentioned there that Ezra Stoller, who was a great photographer on the east coast of the US, the great architectural photographer who photographed all the modernist buildings from the 1940s onwards. Somebody I had actually met and had great regard for. I saw Stoller's exhibition after the Madan show that I had done here in New York again, and my heart kind of sank. And he's a great photographer, but I actually began to feel that actually those buildings were not as great. And, you know, there's some really visionary work here. And it only hits you when you realize the context. You know, we become very complacent. We forget the cultural roots and we forget that cultural moment. And that's what I've tried to define a little bit here today. And why is it? And I was hoping that this is not nostalgic, but there are lessons in terms of visionary design, which you know, can maybe go down to the younger generation, at least now.
Tell us about your petition.
Which petition? Oh, I'm just saying that I was going to, everyone who opposes the tearing down of the buildings in the trade fair, please raise your hands. And everyone photograph it. Where is Mahavir? Please photograph. Make sure their faces are documented. So when the police comes for you, yeah.
I think, Ram, one of the interesting things about why the period you've covered is so valuable is that India, just after independence, received two streams of architectural culture. One came from America, and that was brought by Stein and Ram's father, Kanvinde. And this was really a part of a continuation of the Frank Lloyd Wright, exploring materiality and constructing in those interesting ways. The other stream came from Europe, which came through Corbusier and came in concrete. And that has Jugal Chaudhry and all of these Kuldeep Singhs, etc., came out of that particular tradition. So I think India as a ground for having both these streams of modernism, and steel never came. So the whole Frank Lloyd Wright and that, the Mies van der Rohe tradition never came to India. But the pre-steel traditions from both the streams came to India, and we are actually the only place in the world where both of them exist simultaneously, and that was mainly because of Nehru. So we'll have one last question before we... Yes, anybody? All right, no more questions?
There's
One more, yes.
It's actually a comment,
Okay.
but it sort of fits into Ram's framework. Kamla Devi, you forgot her.
No, I mentioned Kamla Devi.
Did you? Well, I think
Yeah,
you
yeah.
could do much more with
Yeah,
her-
no, about
her
the setting
work,
up of
yeah.
cottage industries,
HHEs,
etc.
yeah. But there's also another strand which fits in, which is the town planning thing by Lakshmi Jain and Faridabad and all that, which I think, in a sense, would be
In
worth
fact-
coming in, yeah.
I didn't read that. The first part of the text that I had here was a quote from Shafi Said, which was actually quite interesting. You know, and you find now on the web you can trace articles in the newspapers which came out a while ago. And Shafi, this was a piece from the Hindu, which was quite interesting. Talking about the American tradition, Shafi was talking about town planning in Delhi, and he says, while B.G. Kambo and I did architecture from MIT, there was B.G. Fernandez, a pass out of UCLA. This is all in the 50s, mid-50s. B.N. Rahalkar, a landscape architect from Harvard, and yet another architect, Sri Manohar from the University of North Carolina. In this vibrant company, I had the great advantage of building my own city. Now, these were the planners, the urban planners. And Albert Mayer, who had worked on Chandigarh also, had been in Delhi, had been brought as an advisor, and he kind of mentored many of these. But Shafi also says here, Nehru famously used to call Delhi the graveyard of many an empire and the nursery of a new republic. He was very interested in building a great city out of Delhi. This was Shafi's quote. So,
Well, thank you very much, Ram, for a terrific talk.
thank you for sitting through an overly long, but thank God I didn't pay too much attention to the time. Thank you.
But you know the thing is, Ram, you were in the dark.